On my 16th birthday, a day that most girls in Missouri dream of for years, my parents decided to completely erase my existence while celebrating my older brother instead. My name is Presley, and I spent years perfecting the art of being invisible in my own home just to keep the peace between us all. While I stood there in the kitchen with an empty plate and no cake in sight, my father handed my brother Everett a brand new iPhone 17 Pro Max. The room was filled with their laughter and the bright glow of a screen that cost more than everything I owned combined, yet no one even glanced in my direction. I realized at that exact moment that I was not just a daughter to them, but a ghost, haunting a house that had already moved on without me. I left that very night with nothing but a backpack and a heart full of cold, sharp clarity about my future. They probably thought I was just throwing a childish tantrum or hiding in a friend's basement to get some attention for once. Before we dive deeper into how I turned their world upside down, I would love to know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you enjoy dramatic tales of family justice, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell to support our community. Don't forget to drop a comment below because your engagement helps me share more stories like this with the world. Next, I will tell you about the years of quiet resentment that led to that final breaking point in the Ozarks. In the quiet, judgmental corners of the Ozarks, the Roland and Fay household stood as a monument to a specific kind of American favoritism that slowly strangles the soul. My mother, Fay, was a woman who lived for the curated perfection of her social media feeds, capturing every smile of my brother, while I was relegated to the blurry background of their lives. Growing up in that house felt like constantly breathing someone else's exhausted air, as if my very presence was an inconvenience to their carefully polished family portrait. My father, Roland, worked as a financial consultant, a man who could calculate the value of every penny, but seemed utterly incapable of estimating the emotional cost of his own neglect. Everett was 18 and had always been the sun around which their entire universe revolved, receiving every upgrade, every new pair of sneakers, and every ounce of their vocal pride. I survived by working double shifts at a local diner, scrubbing grease off heavy iron griddles until my fingernails were stained and my back ached, just so I could afford my own basic necessities. I noticed that my father would often ask for my social security number or my signature on various papers, claiming it was for college savings or tax credits that would eventually benefit my future. I trusted him because he was my father, never suspecting that the man who taught me to ride a bike was actually using my clean credit history to mask the rotting foundations of his own financial failures. Every time I dared to mention my own needs or the upcoming milestone of my 16th birthday, my mother would simply sigh and tell me to stop being so demanding when the family was sacrificing so much for Everett's upcoming university tuition. They didn't see me as a person with dreams, but as a secondary character whose only job was to stay quiet and not disrupt the narrative of their golden boy's success. The house was filled with expensive electronics and new furniture that I was barely allowed to sit on, while my bedroom remained a cold cell furnished with the broken leftovers of Everett's childhood. I learned to keep my thoughts locked away in a small notebook I hid under my mattress, recording every slight and every instance of being overlooked, like a silent witness to my own erasure. The atmosphere was always thick with an unspoken rule that Everett's happiness was the family's priority, and any deviation from that focus was treated as a personal attack on our parents' hard work. On the morning of my birthday, I woke up hoping for a single card or even a simple acknowledgement over breakfast, but the house was already buzzing with excitement for something else entirely. I watched from the hallway as my mother prepared a lavish brunch, her eyes shining with a frantic kind of joy that she never directed toward me, even when I brought home straight A's on my report card. Roland was busy on his laptop, his brow furrowed in a way that I now recognize as the stress of a man whose lies were beginning to catch up with him, though he still found time to laugh at Everett's jokes. I realized then that I could graduate at the top of my class or win a Nobel Prize, and it would still never be enough to pull their gaze away from the son who did nothing but consume. My 16th year was supposed to be a beginning, but as I stood in the shadows of our living room, it felt much more like a final terminal conclusion to my life in that house. 4 hours after the party lights dimmed and the celebratory echoes of Everett's new gift faded into the heavy silence of the night, I moved with the precision of someone who had been planning her escape for a lifetime. I didn't cry as I stuffed my few belongings into a weathered duffel bag, focusing instead on the heavy weight of the cash I had saved from 2 years of grueling shifts at the diner. I stepped out onto the porch, the humid Missouri air clinging to my skin, and walked toward the bus station without a single backward glance at the place that had never truly been a home. My destination was clear in my mind because my Uncle Silas lived 3 towns over and had been the only relative who ever called my parents out on their blatant hypocrisy and toxic favoritism. Silas was a retired mechanic with grease-stained hands and a sharp tongue, a man who had been cast out of the family circle years ago for refusing to play along with Roland's delusions of grandeur. I arrived at his doorstep just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, and he didn't ask a single question as he opened the door and pointed toward the spare room in the back. He understood the look in my eyes because it was the same fire of resentment he had carried for decades, and he simply told me that as long as I worked hard, I would always have a roof over my head. For the first time in 16 years, I didn't have to apologize for existing or lower my voice to avoid irritating a brother who took up all the space in the world. Silas gave me a job in his shop, teaching me how to take apart engines and put them back together, showing me that power was something you built with your own hands rather than something you inherited through favoritism. My best friend Skylar was the only person from my old life who knew where I was, and she silently gathered the rest of my school books and personal items, delivering them to me under the cover of a weekend trip. She told me that my parents hadn't even noticed I was gone for the first 24 hours, assuming I was simply brooding in my room or staying late at work to avoid them. When they finally did realize my bed hadn't been slept in, Roland had apparently made a joke about me being a drama queen who would crawl back the moment I got hungry or ran out of money. Hearing that from Skylar didn't hurt as much as I expected it to, because it only confirmed that the version of me they had in their heads was a weak, dependent child who didn't exist anymore. Silas encouraged me to enroll in a new school district using his address, and he helped me navigate the legal paperwork to ensure that I could remain under his care without my parents' immediate interference. I spent my nights studying by the light of a single lamp in the shop, surrounded by the smell of oil and old metal, feeling more secure than I ever had in the white-shuttered mansion in the Ozarks. I was learning that family wasn't defined by a shared last name, but by the people who actually showed up when the world tried to make you invisible. Every dollar I earned was mine, every meal I ate was peaceful, and for the first time the future didn't look like a long, dark tunnel of servitude to my brother's ego. 6 months before I made the decision to walk away, a devastating incident occurred that should have been the final warning sign for anyone with a shred of self-preservation. Everett had been out late at a party driving the brand new SUV my parents had bought him, as a reward for merely graduating high school, while I was at home helping my mother with the household accounts. He came crashing through the front door at 3 a.m, smelling of cheap beer and panic crying that he had hit a parked car and fled the scene before the police arrived. My mother, Faye, immediately went into damage control mode, her first instinct not being to reprimand her son, but to protect his precious reputation and his future university prospects. Roland joined her in the kitchen, his face pale as he looked at the dented fender, and then both of them turned their calculated gazes toward me as if I were a pawn on a chessboard. They pressured me to tell the authorities that I had been the one behind the wheel, arguing that since I was only 15 and didn't have a full license yet, the legal consequences would be minimal compared to what Everett would face. He has his whole life ahead of him, Presley, and you've always been the responsible one who doesn't mind staying out of the spotlight. My father whispered, his voice dripping with a manipulative kind of desperation. I stood there in shock, realizing that my own parents were willing to give me a criminal record just to ensure that their golden son didn't have to face the music for his own reckless choices. When I refused, Everett stepped forward and sneered at me, calling me an ungrateful brat and reminding me of all the sacrifices the family had made to keep a roof over my head. For the next week, the house was a war zone of cold shoulders and whispered insults as my parents treated my refusal to commit perjury as a personal betrayal of the highest order. They eventually found a shady body shop to fix the car in secret, but the atmosphere in the house never returned to the fake normal they worked so hard to maintain. Roland began to drop subtle threats about my future college fund, which I already suspected didn't exist, and he made sure to remind me every day that I was a disappointment to the family name. Everett became even more emboldened by their protection, openly mocking my work at the diner and intentionally making messes for me to clean up, just to prove that he could. I realized that my parents didn't just love him more. They viewed him as an extension of themselves, while viewing me as a disposable resource to be used whenever the need arose. I started documenting everything from that night, keeping a hidden folder of photos of the damaged SUV and recordings of their attempts to coerce me into taking the fall. This was the moment I realized that I wasn't just being ignored, I was being targeted as the family's official scapegoat, the one who would always be sacrificed to keep the golden boy shining. I spent the following months being extra obedient, nodding my head and playing the part of the quiet daughter, while I secretly gathered the information I would need to eventually destroy their house of cards. They thought they had broken my spirit, but in reality, they had only given me the perfect motive to ensure that when I finally left, I would leave them with nothing but the consequences of their own actions. Returning to the night of my 16th birthday, the air in the dining room felt heavy with a celebratory energy that had absolutely nothing to do with me. My mother had spent the entire afternoon decorating the table with Everett's favorite colors, even though it was supposed to be my milestone celebration, but I remained silent as I set the places for four. I sat down at the table watching as my father placed a beautifully wrapped box in the center, his eyes beaming with a pride that I had never once felt directed toward my own accomplishments. Everett sat across from me, a smug grin plastered on his face as he reached for the box before anyone had even offered a prayer or a toast. "Open it, son. You've earned this for all the hard work you've put into your social life lately," Roland said with a booming laugh that echoed painfully against the walls of my heart. Everett ripped through the paper, revealing the sleek packaging of the latest iPhone 17 Pro Max, a device that cost more than 6 months of my hard-earned tips at the diner. He began flaunting the camera and the screen, laughing about how he could finally delete his old photos to make room for his university parties, while my mother clapped her hands in delight. I looked down at my own empty plate, realizing that there wasn't even a cupcake with a single candle for me, let alone a gift or a word of acknowledgement. When I finally found my voice and asked if they had forgotten what day it was, my mother didn't even look up from Everett's new phone as she spoke in a dismissive tone. "Presley, don't be so dramatic. You can have Everett's old phone once we get it cleaned up, which is more than enough for a girl your age," she said, her voice dripping with a condescending pity that felt like a slap. Roland nodded in agreement, adding that the family had already spent too much on Everett's tuition and that I should be grateful to even have a seat at the table after my uncooperative behavior during the car incident. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, a realization that these people didn't just overlook me, they actively enjoyed the power they held over my happiness and my future. Everett looked at me and laughed, telling me that I should go back to the kitchen and fetch some more soda since I was already standing up and clearly had nothing better to do. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply stood up, walked to my room, and began the process of leaving that house for the final time. I could hear them laughing in the other room, the sound of the television turning on as they settled in for a movie night that didn't include me, further proving that my absence was as unnoticed as my presence. I left my old cracked phone on the nightstand, wanting to sever every single tie that allowed them to track me or claim ownership over my digital life. As I walked out the back door, I felt the weight of 16 years of neglect falling away, replaced by the heavy, solid reality of the duffel bag on my shoulder and the plan in my head. They had given Everett a phone to connect with the world, but in doing so, they had given me the final reason to disconnect from them forever. The last thing I saw was the glow of the living room window, a warm light that hid the freezing cold reality of the emotional desert they had raised me in. 7 days after I arrived at Silas's shop in the heart of the Ozarks, the world I had left behind began to vibrate with a frantic, selfish energy that had nothing to do with my well-being. I spent that first week working until my hands were numb, helping Silas rebuild a transmission for a local farmer, finding a strange kind of peace in the mechanical logic of gears and oil. Silas had helped me contact a lawyer. He knew a man named Mr. Henderson who specialized in domestic law and financial fraud because I had discovered something disturbing when I checked my credit report. My father had been using my social security number to open multiple high-interest credit cards and even a secondary mortgage in my name, effectively destroying my financial future before it had even begun. We spent hours documenting every unauthorized transaction, every forged signature, and every cent that Roland had stolen from my identity to fund Everett's lifestyle and hide his own debts. I had officially filed a report for identity theft, knowing that this action would trigger a cascade of legal consequences that my father would never be able to run from. Back in our old town, Skylar told me that the atmosphere in the house had shifted from dismissive arrogance to a panicked kind of confusion when they realized I wasn't coming back. They had initially told the neighbors that I was on a prestigious summer camp program, desperate to maintain the illusion of a perfect family, while they privately searched for me. Roland had tried to access the diner's payroll records to see where my checks were being sent, but my old boss, who had always liked me, told him to get lost and threatened to call the police for harassment. They hadn't called the authorities to report me missing because they were terrified of the scrutiny that a police investigation would bring to their own shady financial dealings. It wasn't until the credit card companies started freezing the accounts, and the bank sent a formal notice of investigation, that they realized I was the one behind the curtain. Skylar said that my mother had spent a whole afternoon crying on the porch, not because she missed her daughter, but because she couldn't afford the lease on her new luxury car anymore. Everett was furious because his new iPhone had been deactivated as part of the account freeze, and he was forced to actually interact with the real world without his digital shield. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that the silence I had endured for 16 years was now being reflected back at them in the form of frozen assets and legal notices. Silas told me that I was doing the right thing, that blood didn't give someone the right to rob you of your future or treat you like a disposable tool. I was no longer the quiet girl who hid in her room. I was a witness, a claimant, and a survivor who was finally holding the adults in her life accountable for their crimes. I spent my evenings sitting on the porch of the shop watching the fireflies dance in the Missouri woods, feeling a sense of ownership over my own life that no iPhone or fancy car could ever provide. I knew that the 99 missed calls sitting on my burner phone were not messages of love, but the desperate screams of people who were drowning in a sea of their own making. I was ready to let them sink not out of malice, but out of a fundamental need to finally be free of their suffocating weight. By the Monday of the second week, the vibration of my phone had become a constant rhythmic reminder of the chaos I had unleashed upon the house of Roland and Faye. I finally sat down on the workbench at the shop and scrolled through the 99 missed calls, seeing my father's name repeated over and over like a frantic heartbeat. The message he had sent was the most honest he had been in years, though it was still wrapped in the manipulative language of a man who only cared about himself. "Please come back home, Presley. We need you to sign some papers to clear up this misunderstanding with the bank before we lose everything." The text read, proving that my value to him was still strictly clerical. My mother had left voicemails that alternated between hysterical sobbing and sharp, venomous accusations claiming that I was destroying the family over a simple birthday oversight. She talked about how Everett's future was being ruined because his tuition check had bounced, and how the neighbors were starting to ask questions that she couldn't answer. I listened to one particular recording where Everett's voice was heard in the background shouting that I was a traitorous bitch who deserved to be in jail for what I was doing to them. It was a perfect symphony of their true characters, a clear indication that not a single one of them had spent a moment reflecting on why I had left in the first place. Silas watched me as I deleted the messages one by one, his expression unreadable, but his support absolute as he handed me a cup of strong black coffee. He told me that the bank had already moved forward with a foreclosure notice on the Ozark house because the secondary mortgage Roland had taken out in my 10 was flagged as fraudulent. My father was facing a criminal investigation for identity theft and financial fraud, and because I was a minor, the state of Missouri was taking the case very seriously. They had tried to reach out to Silas, but he had blocked their numbers weeks ago, telling them through a lawyer that he would only communicate with them in a courtroom. I realized that the 99 missed calls were not an attempt at reconciliation, but a desperate attempt to lure me back into their trap so I could take the fall for their crimes once again. The power dynamic had completely shifted. I was the one with the evidence, the one with the clean record, and the one who held the keys to their survival. I felt a strange sense of peace as I realized that I didn't want to save them, and more importantly, I didn't have to. I had spent 16 years trying to save their feelings and their reputation at the cost of my own soul, and I was finally done being the sacrificial lamb. I imagined them sitting in that big white house with the power cut off and the furniture tagged for repossession, wondering how the invisible girl had managed to bring it all down. They had underestimated the quietest person in the room, never realizing that the one who listens is the one who learns exactly where the foundations are weakest. I decided that night that I would never answer those calls because there was nothing left to say to people who only valued me as a signature on a loan document. My future was no longer tied to their failures, and as I looked out at the dark Missouri sky, I knew that the storm I had created was finally clearing the air for me to breathe. 1 year has passed since the night I walked out of that house and changed the trajectory of my life forever, and the distance between who I was and who I am now feels like an entire lifetime. My father, Roland, was eventually forced to plead guilty to multiple counts of financial fraud and identity theft, receiving a sentence that ensured he would never be able to manipulate a credit score again. The mansion in the Ozarks was sold at a sheriff's auction to cover his mounting debts, leaving my mother, Faye, to live in a cramped apartment while she finally had to find a real job to support herself. Everett had to drop out of his expensive university and is currently working a menial job at a warehouse, finally learning what it feels like to be the one scrubbing the floors instead of the one making the mess. I haven't spoken to any of them since the day I stood in court and testified about the years of neglect and the specific moment they tried to steal my identity. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful apologies that felt sincere, and no desire on my part to ever let them back into my world. I am currently finishing high school while working as a lead apprentice in Silas's shop, having discovered a genuine talent for engineering that I never would have found if I had stayed in their shadow. My point of view has shifted from one of a victim to that of a survivor who understands that blood doesn't grant anyone the right to destroy your life for their own convenience. I have my own car, now a sturdy truck that I rebuilt with my own hands, and a bank account that is protected by a security system my father can never touch. Skylar and I are planning to head to a technical college next year, and for the first time, my birthday is a day that I celebrate with people who actually see me and value my presence. I learned that leaving a toxic family isn't an act of betrayal, it is an act of self-preservation that requires more courage than staying and suffering in silence. If you are watching this and you feel invisible in your own home, please know that your worth is not defined by the people who are too blind to see it. You do not owe your future to the people who are trying to steal your present, and there is a whole world waiting for you once you decide to stop being a ghost in someone else's story. Thank you so much for listening to my journey from the shadows of the Ozarks to the light of my own independence. Your support and your time mean everything to me, and I hope this story gives you the courage to stand up for yourself when no one else will. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you love to save yourself? I would love to read your stories and build a community where no one has to feel invisible. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button if you believe that justice should always prevail over favoritism. Goodbye for now, and remember that you are the only one who gets to decide who you are going to be.